Welcome to another deep dive. We always like to go deep around here, and today we're going deep on Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Oh, Emerson.
Yeah, you ready for this?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so we're taking a philosopher's look at Emerson, which would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, he is just this fascinating figure, when you think about, American intellectual history, and especially in the 19th century, he's really trying to synthesize all these different intellectual trends.
Right, and he's a little difficult to categorize. I've heard him described as a transcendentalist, but also a proto-pragmatist.
Yeah, and we'll see as we go through his work how those threads are really intertwined.
Yeah, I'm excited to unpack all that. But before we get too deep into the ideas, let's just start with some context, for our listener who maybe hasn't spent as much time with Emerson. Give us the Spark Notes version of his life, just the stuff that's, really essential to understanding his philosophy.
Sure. Well, he was born in 1803, so right in the thick of this, American intellectual and cultural awakening. And his father was a Unitarian minister, so religion was a big part of his upbringing.
Right. And he went to Harvard Divinity School even for a while, right?
That's right. Yeah. So, really steeped in that classical theological tradition.
Yeah.
But he ends up breaking away.
Yeah, which is key.
Yeah. Yeah. So he leaves the ministry, becomes a lecturer and writer, and that act of rebellion, I think, is key to understanding his whole trajectory.
It's like he's saying, forget the dogma. I'm gonna find truth on my own terms.
Exactly. And so this is where his influences, I think, get really interesting, because he's reading everything. He's reading Plato, Kant, the Hindu scriptures, just this wide range of thinkers, and he's trying to, weave together this tapestry of ideas.
It's like he was this intellectual omnivore.
Yeah.
Just consuming everything and synthesizing it all.
Yeah. And Romanticism was obviously a huge influence, the emphasis on emotion, intuition. But he's also wrestling with, more rational systematic philosophy.
Right. So he's not just, this wild-eyed mystic. He's a rigorous thinker.
Absolutely.
And we see that synthesis, playing out in I think one of his most famous essays, The American Scholar.
Yeah, The American Scholar.
Where he really lays out this vision for education. And it's so much more than, just hitting the books or, memorizing facts.
Right. It's about self-discovery.
Yeah.
It's about engaging with nature, with experience. That's where this term that's so central to his work, this idea of the active soul, comes in.
Okay, so let's break that down, because that's one of those Emersonian terms. He can be a little slippery.
Yeah.
So for our listener who's coming at this from a philosophical perspective,
yeah,
how would you define what Emerson means by active soul?
Yeah, it's really about the mind not being some kind of passive receiver of information, but this active force that shapes meaning through its interaction with the world. So it's not enough to just, read about nature. You have to go out and experience it, let it work on your soul. Same with books. They're not just vessels of knowledge, they're tools for sparking your own thinking.
So education isn't just about, acquiring information. It's about cultivating this active soul that can then engage with the world critically and creatively.
Exactly.
And this has huge implications for his whole approach to, knowledge and truth. Because if knowledge comes from experience, then truth isn't something static and absolute. It's something we discover through this process of engagement.
Right. And that's where his concept of process comes in, this idea that the universe is constantly in flux, always becoming.
Permanence is but a word of degrees.
Yes, exactly. He loved that line. And so, even our understanding of truth needs to be flexible, adaptable, constantly evolving.
So he's really challenging this notion of a, static, unchanging universe and a fixed absolute truth.
Yes, and he's doing this in the 19th century, which is incredible. It's so forward-thinking, and that idea of process is at the heart of his epistemology, I think.
Okay, so now we're getting philosophical. So break down this epistemology of process for us. What are the implications of this idea for how we think about knowledge and truth?
Well, if the universe is constantly changing, truth can't be something static and final. It's something we glimpse, in moments and flashes of insight, but it's always evolving along with the world around us.
Right. He has that great quote where he says, "We have a choice between truth and repose, but we cannot have both."
Right.
So true knowledge requires this restlessness, this willingness to keep seeking to never be satisfied with easy answers.
Exactly. And that pursuit is so intimately tied to action. It's not enough to just contemplate ideas. You have to test them in the real world, see how they hold up against experience. And that's where his emphasis on self-reliance comes in.
Right.
Right.
And it's not, self-reliance in the rugged individualist sense, like his friend Thoreau retreating to the woods.
Exactly.
It's something a little different.
It's about cultivating this inner strength, this independence of thought and this courage to be your authentic self, even when that means, defying social conventions.
Yeah, he talks about these nonchalant boys who judge the world so freely,
Right.
unburdened by this need to please or conform.
Right. They're sure of a dinner, he writes, and they would disdain as much as a lord to do or say ought to conciliate one.
Right.
So they have this kind of effortless self-assurance.
They're guided by their own internal compass.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, too, because for Emerson, the self isn't static.
Yeah.
It's constantly being created and recreated through our actions and our engagement with the world.
Right. He even writes that to talk of reliance is a poor external way of speaking. Speak rather of that which relies because it works and is.
So it's this ongoing process of self-discovery and self-creation, and that's where his critique of traditional Christianity comes in.
Yeah. I
He
think
saw, organized religion, particularly as it was practiced in his time, as, too focused on dogma and ritual, too concerned with the afterlife,
Yeah.
and not enough with living this fully engaged life in the present.
Right. And again, this is where this idea of the active soul comes full circle. True spirituality should be about cultivating that inner spark, about experiencing the divine directly through our engagement with the world, not through blind adherence to external authority.
And he was very critical
Oh, he was scathing.
in that divinity school address
Yes.
about, what he called historical Christianity.
Right. He felt like it had become so lifeless a shadow of the vibrant faith that he saw embodied by Jesus.
So he wasn't rejecting spirituality altogether. He was calling for a more authentic, more lived form of faith.
Exactly, one that's grounded in personal experience, in a direct connection with the divine that we can find, in nature, in art, in those moments of profound insight. And this connects to his concept of power, which is another, really key idea for Emerson. And he sees power not as something to be wielded over others, but this creative force that flows from within.
It's unleashed through action and self-expression,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
He talks about this bird which alights nowhere.
Yeah, constantly in motion.
So power isn't about domination or control. It's about harnessing this inner energy, this creative spark to, bring something new and beautiful into the world.
That's right.
And he sees the artist, as a kind of exemplar of this power. Right?
Yes, yeah. The artist for Emerson is someone who's able to tap into that creative force and, make something new and beautiful out of the raw materials of experience.
And he has this great line where he talks about, in history, the great moment is when the savage is just ceasing to be a savage with all his hairy plastic strength directed on his opening sense of beauty. And you have Pericles and Phidias not yet passed over into the Corinthian civility.
I love that image.
It's just so evocative, right?
Yeah.
It's about embracing your own unique gifts and using them to, make a difference, to leave the world a little bit better than you found it.
Yeah, and that's what's so inspiring about Emerson. He's not just offering these abstract philosophical ideas. He's challenging us to live a more authentic, more meaningful life.
Right, to tap into that power within ourselves and use it to, make a real impact.
Right.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about this active soul, the universe as a process, self-reliance, this constant striving, his critique of traditional Christianity, and his call for this more lived spirituality.
Right. We've laid some real groundwork here.
We have, but there's so much more to explore.
Oh, yeah. We've just scratched the surface. Next we need to delve into his concept of unity and how he reconciles that with this emphasis on process and change.
Okay, so that's where things get really interesting, especially for a philosopher.
Yeah.
I can't wait to dive into that.
Let's do it. So, we've been talking about the active soul and this idea of the universe as a process and Emerson's emphasis on self-reliance. But now I think we need to grapple with a concept that's, even more fundamental to his thought and really intriguing for a philosopher like yourself, this idea of unity.
Yeah, you mentioned at the end of the last part that this is where things get really interesting.
It is, because Emerson doesn't shy away from paradox. He talks about this underlying oneness in the universe, this interconnectedness of all things, but he also emphasizes, process, constant change flux.
Right, so how did those two ideas coexist? How do you have this ultimate unity, and yet everything's always in motion, everything's always changing?
Right, and he doesn't offer any easy answers. He's really wrestling with this tension between the one and the many, between permanence and change, and I think that's what makes him, so challenging and rewarding to read.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So where do we see this tension playing out most explicitly in his work?
Well, I think one of the key places is in his essay, The Oversoul. This is where he really grapples with the idea of a unifying principle, this transcendent consciousness that connects us all. But even there, he doesn't try to, smooth over the contradictions or kind of create this neat and tidy system.
He acknowledges the difficulty of reconciling
Uh-huh.
this ultimate unity with the messy, chaotic reality of our everyday experience.
Exactly. And he doesn't want to fall into, a simplistic idealism that denies the reality of, change and difference. He's trying to hold both of those perspectives, the transcendent and the immanent, the eternal and the temporal, without collapsing one into the other.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah, it is.
And that's where his concept of what he calls the epistemology of moods comes in, right?
Yes, exactly. And remember, he's not just this, mystic. He's also deeply engaged with, questions of knowledge and perception.
Right. We talked earlier about, his view of truth is something that we grasp in glimpses and moments of insight.
Exactly. And he's suggesting that we never apprehend anything directly, in its pure form, but always through the filter of our own moods, our subjective experiences.
So even our grand visions of unity are always colored by our own internal states.
Exactly. He writes in Experience that life is a train of moods, like a string of beads. And each bead kind of focuses our attention on a particular aspect of reality. But the beads themselves are constantly shifting, changing, influencing how we see the world.
That raises a really interesting question. If our experience of reality is so fluid, so dependent on our mood, does that mean that there's no objective truth? Is it all just subjective interpretation?
Yeah, and Emerson grapples with that question. No, he doesn't offer a definitive answer. I think he seems to suggest that there might be some ultimate truth, some underlying unity, but that we can only grasp it, in those fleeting moments when our moods align with the deeper currents of reality.
Like those moments of sudden clarity or profound insight where everything seems to click into place?
Exactly, and that's where his essay Nominalist and Realist, I think, comes in. It's one of his most direct attempts to, really reconcile the one and the many, the universal and the particular, and he talks about, the universe as an old two-face, of which any proposition may be affirmed or denied.
So he's acknowledging that there are, multiple, even contradictory ways of seeing the world.
Right.
And they all might contain a grain of truth.
Exactly. And I think he's suggesting that, the key is to embrace this multiplicity, this fluidity of perspective without losing sight of the possibility of a deeper unity that underlies it all.
It's a challenging idea, but also incredibly liberating.
Yeah.
It frees us from the need to cling to these rigid, fixed interpretations of reality.
Yeah, and it encourages us to be open to new perspectives, to embrace the mystery and complexity of the world. And I think this brings us to another aspect of Emerson's legacy that I think is really important to discuss, and that's his views on slavery and race.
Yeah, this is a part of his work that often generates debate, and I think it's important to approach it with nuance and sensitivity. So how do we, as, philosophers or people who are engaging with his work, how do we approach this aspect of his thought?
Well, on the one hand, Emerson was a staunch abolitionist. He saw slavery as a moral abomination, a violation of the fundamental principles of human dignity and equality.
And he wasn't just speaking out against it, theoretically.
Yeah.
He was actively involved in the abolitionist movement.
Absolutely. He gave speeches, he supported escaped slaves, he even advocated for disobedience of the fugitive slave law.
And his descriptions of slavery are really powerful and unflinching.
Yeah, he talks about the need to ransack the secrets of slaughterhouses, to reveal the true horrors of slavery.
He uses this really vivid imagery to expose the brutality of the system and really urge his audience to see the humanity of those who were enslaved.
Right. And yet, despite his unwavering opposition to slavery, his writings on race sometimes contain, problematic pronouncements that reflect the prejudices of his era.
Yeah, there's a tension there that I think runs through a lot of his work.
Yeah.
He's striving for a more just and equitable world, but he's also grappling with the limitations of his own understanding, the biases of his time.
Exactly. And so, in his essay Fate, he talks about this steadiness with which victory adheres to one tribe and defeat to another. And that language really echoes the racial hierarchies of his day.
Right. And even in English traits, while he's critiquing this idea of, pure races, he still makes generalizations about different groups of people that could be seen as stereotypical.
Yeah, and I think it's a reminder that, even the most brilliant minds are products of their historical context. And that we need to read Emerson critically, engage with both the brilliance and the blind spots of his thought.
So how do we reconcile those two sides of Emerson, the visionary thinker who championed individual freedom, and the flawed human being who, sometimes reflected the prejudices of his time.
That's the challenge, and I think it's a challenge worth embracing. Emerson's work is like this vast and fertile garden full of both, beautiful flowers and thorny weeds. And it's up to us as readers to kind of cultivate that garden carefully, to tend to the blossoms, but also, be mindful of the
Like,
thorns.
it's about recognizing that even the most profound thinkers are fallible, that their ideas are always evolving, and that it's our responsibility to engage with their work critically, to glean the wisdom, but also, challenge the limitations.
And Emerson himself embraced this idea of continual growth and evolution. He
Yeah.
believed that the human mind was always becoming, always striving for something more.
Which makes the question of early versus late Emerson so interesting. There are definitely shifts in tone and emphasis over the course of his career.
There are, yeah. You see a real difference between the youthful optimism of nature and then the more somber reflections of experience, which he wrote after the death of his son Waldo.
That's a turning point.
Yeah.
You can really sense the weight of that loss,
Yeah.
the awareness of life's fragility in his later writings.
Hmm.
He's still hopeful, still idealistic in many ways, but there's this greater sense of, the limits of human agency, the power of circumstance.
Right. It's like he's acknowledging that self-reliance isn't, this magic billet that can solve all of life's problems. There are forces at play that we can't control, tragedies that can, shake us to our core. But even in the face of those challenges, he never gives up on the possibility of growth, of transformation.
And that's what makes him so inspiring.
Mm.
He's not offering this simplistic feel-good philosophy. He's grappling with the hard realities of life while still holding on to, a belief in the human capacity for good, for creativity, for meaning-making.
And that's where his enduring influence comes in, I think. He didn't just write for his own time. His ideas have resonated across generations. They've shaped the thinking of philosophers, writers, social activists. We mentioned Nietzsche and Dewey, but the list goes on and on.
It's incredible how his ideas have, taken root and blossomed in so many different ways. It speaks to the depth and complexity of his work, the way he was able to articulate these, universal human longings, these fundamental questions about meaning and purpose.
And his work feels especially relevant today, I think, in a world that often feels, fragmented and uncertain. He reminds us of the importance of cultivating inner strength, of finding meaning in our own experiences, of connecting with something larger than ourselves.
He offers this vision of self-reliance. It's not about, isolation or individualism, but about finding our place in the web of life, about contributing our unique gifts to the world. And he challenges us to embrace, the complexity and contradiction of existence, to be open to new perspectives, to never stop learning and growing. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Emerson, I want to leave our listener with a final thought.
What's that?
Emerson's ideas are like seeds. They take root in the mind, and they continue to grow long after you've finished reading. The real question is, what will you do with those seeds? How will you cultivate them? How will you let them shape your own understanding of the world and your place in it?
That's a perfect note to end on. Emerson believed in the power of each individual to make a difference. He believed that the world was constantly being remade, through our actions, our thoughts, our choices. What kind of world will you help to create?
Happy exploring. We were just talking about Emerson's influence, and I think it's so interesting how different thinkers have been drawn to, different aspects of his work. Like they're each highlighting a different facet of this really complex philosophical gem.
Yeah, it's like a prism. You turn it and you see a different color.
Exactly.
And I think that speaks to the richness and the complexity of his thought.
Yeah.
You take someone like Nietzsche, for example.
Right.
He was really drawn to Emerson's ideas about power, about, the strong, overflowing individual who creates their own values. And that really resonated with Nietzsche's own ideas about the Übermensch, right? The individual who transcends, conventional morality.
Right. And you can definitely see how Emerson's vision of self-reliance, could be interpreted through that very individualistic lens.
Absolutely.
But then you have someone like John Dewey, who I think focused more on Emerson's emphasis on experience and the interconnectedness of thought and action.
Exactly. And Dewey really saw Emerson as a precursor to pragmatism, this philosophy that, emphasizes the practical consequences of ideas and the importance of texting those ideas through experience. So for Dewey, Emerson's idea of the active soul was really a key insight because it highlighted this role of human agency in shaping the world.
Right. And then, of course, there's Stanley
Oh,
Cavell, who's
yes.
done some really brilliant work on Emerson, and he's really explored Emerson's moral perfectionism. This
Yes.
this idea that, we're all on this journey of self-cultivation, always striving to become our best selves.
And Cavell sees Emerson as a philosopher of democracy, as
Yeah.
someone who, really believed in the capacity of ordinary individuals to participate in the creation of a more just and equitable society. And he sees this emphasis on self-reliance not as a call to, isolation or withdrawing from the world, but as a challenge to engage with the world in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how these ideas, that Emerson was articulating in the 19th century are still so relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. They've taken root and blossomed in, so many different directions.
Yeah, and it makes you realize that reading Emerson isn't really this passive activity.
Yeah.
It's an invitation to join this conversation that's been going on for centuries, to really grapple with these fundamental questions about what it means to be human, to live a meaningful life.
He's not giving us a set of answers. He's giving us a set of questions, a framework for thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into Emerson, I want to, remind our listeners that we've explored, some of his core ideas, the active soul, this idea of the universe as a process, self-reliance as this constant striving, his critique of traditional Christianity, his vision for a more lived spirituality, his complex views on unity, on race. But, ultimately, I think the most important thing isn't to just memorize these ideas, it's to engage with them, to let them spark your own
To
thinking.
make them your own.
Right, to take those seeds that Emerson has planted and cultivate them, in the fertile ground of your own mind.
And see what grows.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to our listener, as you continue your own exploration of Emerson, I think the questions to ask yourself are, what resonates most with you? What challenges you? Where do you see connections to your own life, your own experiences, your own philosophical journey?
Yeah. What will you do with those seeds?
Exactly.
Hmm.
Because Emerson's work is a gift. It's an invitation to think deeply, to question, to challenge, to grow.
Embrace that gift.
Happy exploring.